Hi, everyone, and welcome to another virtual event at Hobby Memorial Library. I'm Cindy Oser, and we have a very special guest today, CTC Professor Dr. Mervyn Roberts. He is pretty much an expert on anything Vietnam War history. He teaches history, correct?
Correct.
Yes, and he is going to be doing a very fascinating event today on Killeen's own Doolittle Robert Bob Gray, and we're very excited to learn about this today. So I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away, sir.
All right. Well, thank you, Cindy, for introducing me today and allowing me to say a few words about Robert Gray on the 80th anniversary of the Doolittle raid. Unfortunately, his name is regrettably forgotten to many, but not the residents here in Killeen, where for 80 years, whether people knew it or not, the city's proclaimed this April 18th as Robert Gray Day ever since the Doolittle raid. And his is a legacy that's rightly deserving to be remembered, I think, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. In February of 1951, Captain Bob Gray was interred at Killeen, Texas, nearly 10 years after the crash that took his life. As the Killeen Reporter put it that week, Bob Gray back home with loved ones. During the intervening decade, his hometown, and indeed the world, had been transformed by the war that he had played such an early critical role. Now, Bob grew up in, trying to get the slides here, bear with me. There we go. Bob grew up in Killeen, not far from the hardware store his family owned on Gray. It used to be 6th Street in Killeen. And he graduated from Killeen High School in 1937 before attending Tarleton College. Before his departure from Killeen, it was a tiny little village of just 1,300 souls, a whistle stop on the railroad going up to Santa Fe. Everybody in town knew the precocious Bob Gray, and by the time he returned, this town had blossomed to 8,000, not including the giant Fort Hood nearby. The path that led him home started with that Doolittle raid. As war clouds gathered in 1940, he had enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and in about 7 months later, graduated from flying school and was assigned out to McCord Airfield in Washington State. Shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, Gray volunteered again for an undisclosed mission and spent the spring training for and participating in Doolittle's bombing raid on Tokyo. Exactly 6 months after that raid, he volunteered yet again for a mission and was killed in a crash in the mountains of western Burma. Robert Gray's B-25, nicknamed Whiskey Pete after his favorite horse, had not so much launched as separated from the Hornet while the bow crashed through a violent trough. On his first carrier takeoff, and one of the few from a B-25 ever in history, they were launched 200 miles early, as you see on this map here, because they were spotted by a Japanese ship, and so they had to, it was either launch or scrub the mission. But launching 200 miles earlier meant that they wouldn't have fuel to make it to their target landing spots. So, recalling a letter they received from Bob, his parents recounted the, quote, difficulty getting his heavily loaded plane off the carrier, but with a prayer on his lips and steel in his heart, a few short hours later, he and the crew were returning the blows to the Japanese installations. The lonely craft had struggled above the waves, grinding towards Tokyo to target a factory district. Receiving ineffective anti-aircraft fire, the 23-year-old Gray felt the concussion of unseen bombs and scattered incendiary bombs and machine gunned a barracks complex on the way out. Because of that early launch from the Hornet, they knew they couldn't reach the prearranged landing strip in China, and he had to prepare the crew for bailing out. As the fuel touched critical, Gray ordered the men to jump, and after assuring everybody was ready, he switched to autopilot and from 6,200 feet was the last man out of the crippled plane. From the alarming chaos of the doomed craft, Gray, likely in his first parachute jump, slipped into the silent, inky calm beneath the rustling silk chute. In an after-action report, Lieutenant Gray described his arrival in China, writing, "The next morning, I looked for other personnel, but could not find them. Walked all day and came to a village where I stayed the night. Eventually, Gray and other crew members rode in Chinese palanquins to the river, then a small boat to Chukchow, followed by a train and bus travel to Hengyan and a flight to Chongqing." News of the bombing plan was kept strictly secret. At a press conference 3 days after the attack, President Roosevelt coyly surmised that the bombers had come from, quote, "our new secret base in Shangri-La." A month later, only after the crews were safely out of Japanese-controlled areas, the War Department at last released details on the raid. Newspapers across America then led with banner headlines about the strike and discussed the raid in detail. In Texas, the papers radiated pride over the state's 14 native sons, not least of all Robert Gray, who had taken part in the raid. Texas flyers in major role beamed the Goose Creek Daily Sun in 20 May 1942. The author wrote, "Killeen practically went on a parade when it heard about Lieutenant Gray being on the raid." Following day, the Borger Daily Herald glowed that Gray, a star tackle in the Killeen high school football team and letterman at John Tarleton College, was now dropping bombs. The Texas Mohair Weekly quoted Killeen high school football coach Leo Buckley as saying, "Whatever the job was, no matter how tough, if they gave it to Bob, he'd get it done." The story reiterated that the folks in Killeen had held a camp meeting in the streets to celebrate for Bob. Later, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported on now General Doolittle's return to America. The story noted that he was the only raider to have returned by that point. The raid leader said, "Others are still out of the country, but most of them are well and happy, I can assure you." Like many of the other raiders, First Lieutenants Richard Joyce and Robert Gray, awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross as pilots on the Tokyo raid, remained in Asia. The Georgetown Sun later remarked that Gray had also gotten a message of thanks from Madame Chang. Bob's mother proudly displayed the medal Madame Chiang Kai-shek had presented to her son, along with a letter of heartfelt thanks to the men after the, quote, "inhumanities and barbarities of the Japanese military." Even as morale-boosting raid was underway, U.S. leaders struggled to plan for the larger war needed to actually defeat Japan. Critical to this goal was keeping China, riven by civil war and struggling against Japanese assault, in the fight. As Madame Chang described, this was a dark period for the nation. The British had closed the Burma Road for several months in 1940 in hopes of assuaging Japan. The German invasion of Russia further restricted aid to China via the Silk Road supply route. The Americans stepped in to fill the gap in the fall of 41 using the briefly reopened Burma Road to transfer Lend-Lease aid, and the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, had unofficially provided air cover for the past year, but American leaders knew more was needed. President Roosevelt prodded the Joint Chiefs of Staff to create the China-Burma-India CBI theater to lead the resupply effort and stage a bombing campaign in support of Chiang's forces. This could also provide a stable base from which to strike Japan in earnest. However, Germany was the main effort, and Americans needed to achieve its goals in China at a small cost, depending on the British and the Chinese to carry the main burden of the ground conflict. This European-first strategy relied on sustaining Chinese to continue their 4-year war against Japan until such time as the full force of American power could be brought to bear. However, the Japanese conquest of Burma later in the year cut the overland supply routes to China as they advanced deep into Burma. The Chinese 38th Division, along with British and Indian forces, then withdrew to Assam, India. The supply line now depended on a long and difficult airlift over the high peaks of the Himalayas, the hump, from northeast India to the main logistical base in Kunming in southwestern China. Thus, the hump airlift became materially and symbolically central to the whole strategy in the CBI. The U.S. Army Air Force began creating the air bridge from whole cloth. The original plan was to fly supplies from Dinjan to Kunming via Myitkyina, necessitating the construction of aircraft or airfields at each of those locations, especially at Dinjan, to make the system work. $10 million were budgeted for the program of airfield construction, but with looming summer monsoons, completion of the base was not expected until November. The prospects of using local labor in India to build more were being hurt by Mahatma Gandhi's nationalist Quit India campaign. Work on the Dinjan fields began in February using 2,600 native women to manually crush the 11 million cubic feet of stone necessary to lay the runway. Furthermore, local laborers were used to refuel aircraft by hand and load the aircraft cargo. Regardless, airlift from Dinjan began in April with a handful of airplanes and air crews composed largely of Pan Am pilots sent there to help after the expected arrival of the Dolittle raid planes. The austere airstrip sat at the end of among the longest logistical tales in military history. As noted, the hump became the only route to China after the Japanese closed the Burma Road and later captured Myitkyina. All supplies and equipment were shipped from the United States' east coast, braving the Atlantic U-boat packs, rounding the treacherous Cape of Good Hope on a 13,000-mile voyage to the port of Karachi in present-day Pakistan. At times, more than 200 ships waited in the harbor to be unloaded. Then supplies traveled by rail, riverboat, and finally by air from Dinjan to Kunming. Robert Gray arrived in the midst of this tumultuous commotion. The initial CBI theater development witnessed ad hoc organizations cobbled together a few airplanes and crews and a catch-as-catch-can attitude. Individual pilots chose who to fly with and which routes to take. Gray operated as a freelance at Dinjan after his arrival in June of 1942, initially flying P-40s on reconnaissance missions over Burma, though not officially assigned to a unit there. Other Dolittle raiders assigned to Dinjan included pilots Richard Cole and Richard Joyce, and gunner George Larkin. Eventually, the Kunming, China-based 11th Bomb Squadron assigned 2 B-25s to form a detachment at Dinjan, and Gray joined that detachment and began flying bombing missions. The danger of flying the hump under these circumstances cannot be understated. For instance, 341st Bomb Squadron or Bomb Group history noted in June of 1942, 6 B-25s departed Dinjan for Kunming, disregarding adverse weather reports. 3 of the ships followed each other into a mountain. 1 was shot down, 1 ran out of gas, and only 1 of the 6 made it to Kunming. The treacherous, cloud-socked mountains were often more deadly than the Japanese. Despite living among the verdant tea plantations and shimmering green rice paddies in the shadow of the looming Himalayas, this remained a war zone. Against that tranquil backdrop, the constant threat of Japanese air attack, the approaching battle lines, and political instability in India kept the airmen ever alert. Although it is likely that a year prior, none of the Americans gave Indian independence a second thought, they were thrust into a cauldron of political intrigue. To top it off, Gray arrived with the 3-month monsoon season. Support facilities in the remote Spartan base suffered as a result of these myriad challenges. Soldiers dealt with a complete lack of mail for many months, an absence of newspapers and books, substandard housing, organizational equipment that didn't arrive. Men slept in a jumble of rickety bamboo huts and tents and washed in buckets, slept under mosquito nets. Lack of cigarettes and pay contributed to the morale issues at Dinjan. Most did their own laundry. To make matters worse, the 341st Bomb Group received no spare parts in June, necessitating cannibalization of airplanes. Are they squawking? Sure, wrote the theater newspaper CBI Roundup, while trying to downplay the problems noted. In July, the detachment flew 11 bombing missions and 2 reconnaissance missions in the vicinity of Japanese-held Michina airfield. The Brownwood Bulletin that month contained a story in which Gray discussed these operations. While on R&R at the 10th Air Force Base in Calcutta, Gray discussed these operations with a UPI reporter. According to the story, the stocky, slow-spoken pilot described how the operations may have halted rail traffic along the strategic Michina line. According to Gray, we understood from intelligence reports that the Japanese were moving plenty of troops up to Michina. He continued, the railway was the only means of troop transport since the rains had swollen the rivers and flooded the roads. We determined that destruction of the river bridge about 45 miles southwest of Michina was the way to halt those communications. On the last mission of the series, Gray said, we flew at about 1,500 feet below a heavy overcast to attack a rail bridge. He described how a .30 caliber bullet tore a 2-inch hole in the right wing of my plane. Another punctured a tire in the landing gear hydraulic line of Joyce's plane. We got back okay, though Joyce had to pump down the wheels by hand and made a beautiful landing. The repair on that hydraulic line may have contributed to a later incident important to this story. The Roundup described life at Dinjan in October as improved, but the base remained a hard, remote post. A story headlined, quote, the Assam boys are now cooking with gas, describes a barren existence for airmen in the easternmost American base in India. At last, though, the airmen could eat prepared chow in a neat mess hall full of tables. Despite the challenges the airmen faced, operations could not stop. The vital air supply line to China must continue. Men worked from before dawn to after dark, cross-training at jobs due to a shortage of personnel. As noted, the 11th Bomb Squadron suffered personnel shortages, meaning crew members had to help with loading bombs and flight preparation. Often crews had nothing to eat between breakfast at 04:30 and an evening meal. Clearly, the effects of all these conditions hit Bob. The Taylor Daily News in October reported that Taylor native Malcolm Connolly, who spent time with Gray in Dinjan, was relaying letters from Gray's parents since the direct mail system did not work for him. They had repeatedly sent letters that were undelivered to Gray. In letters home, he sounded philosophical about his chances. Writing his uncle Fred Page that month, Gray commented that, quote, if I do not make it back, have no fear or regrets, for I will be with him. The tone of the letters reflected the worry his family had over his safety. Also, Gray told his uncle he had been belatedly promoted to captain, another sore spot among those in the CBI as they watched their peers in other theaters rapidly promoted. Indeed, morale at Assam was rated as the lowest in the theater. CBI continued to have the least priority for everything. The Dinjan detachment flew missions over Burma, China almost daily, repeatedly striking critical rail and airfield infrastructure to blunt the Japanese drive. Sweetwater reporter in August story noted they had interrupted service on the 125-mile Mandalay Railroad. The Dinjan detachment chalked up 15 bombing missions in September and added additional personnel. Let's see. So the strategic railway bridge at Meechin and Katha were finally destroyed in late September, and attacks continued throughout this period across Burma. Dinjan detachment conducted 8 missions in October before transferring to Kunming to take part in a series of raids scheduled for the latter part of the month. Lieutenant Joyce was in the field hospital in Dinjan on the 18th when his plane was ordered to bomb a Japanese convoy in Hong Kong. In need of a pilot, Gray volunteered for the job. About 30 minutes out of Dinjan, both of Gray's engines quit simultaneously. Captain Gray and the entire crew were killed instantly. Staff Sergeant Jack Price, an observer with the 51st Fighter Control Squadron based in the Naga Hills, you see in the images here, recovered the bodies. Price reported that while covered in the thick overcast normal to the region, they heard a B-25 and were tracking it when the engines quit. A moment later, we heard a crash to the north of us. 2 days of searching the jungle-clad mountains proved unsuccessful until a child alerted them to the location, and they found the plane in a deep gully in a low valley. An apparent second observer quoted in the accident report stated the plane was directly overhead at 100 feet. Suddenly, the engine sputtered a few times, then quit completely. A few minutes after, a muffled crash was heard in a westerly direction. Fellow Doolittle raider Richard Cole heard one of the two, or saw one of the two 11th Bomb Squadron B-25s take off from Dinjan that afternoon. Cole watched the plane depart, and shortly after he departed in a C-47 carrying fuel to China. As Cole approached the Burma border, he saw a plume of black smoke to his right, and he knew it was either a plane or a bomb strike on a fuel depot. As they flew over the remote jungle area, they saw it was a plane, and with no chutes visible, knew there could be no survivors. He radioed Dinjan to report the crash, and after returning, learned of Gray's death. Cole himself had flown the same B-25 the day prior on a mission, and Gray was considered an excellent pilot with over 550 hours in the B-25. The suspicious circumstances led to scuttlebutt in Dinjan, and according to Cole, many of the pilots suspected sabotage. A number of factors likely contributed to this belief. The accident report listed the crash as a forced landing due to engine failure, but obvious causes eluded those at Dinjan. The weather appeared not to be a factor. The October monsoon had just ended, and the 10th Air Force operational diary noted that visibility and ceiling at Dinjan was unlimited locally, with heavy coverage in the mountains at 15,000 feet. The altitude in the area of the crash was only 6,000 feet, easily outmatched by the B-25 ceiling. His aircraft was rated as new, along with recently overhauled engines. Interestingly, hours before Gray had departed on his final mission, Clark Johnston piloted the other detachment B-25 on a check flight for a newly installed propeller governor. On approach to Dinjan, he became aware of a hydraulic fluid leak causing loss of flaps and landing gear. Engineer George Larkin managed to manually drop the nose and left landing gear and work the flaps. Clark, Larkin, and co-pilot Max West all escaped successfully. Subsequent investigation determined an improper flaring of hydraulic pressure line connections was the cause of the failure. This may have been caused by an unsuitable repair from that incident noted in July. However, given the crash hours later of Gray's plane, which included Larkin and West in that crew, it is easy to understand why many of the airmen might assume it was sabotage. Therefore, the charge Dick Cole made of sabotage cannot be discounted, though the evidence is circumstantial. Reports across Texas that fall covered the rising India unrest in detail. One such story in August, Sweetwater Reporter noted the looming nonviolent revolution in India. Gandhi had declared that the price of accepting Allied troops in India was immediate end to British rule. He threatened to form a mass movement if the demands were not met. In the following week, began the Quit India movement, a sort of nonviolent protest against the Allies' activities in India. 10 days later, the Star Telegram in Fort Worth reported that Britain was considering severe penalties against the Indians involved in the resulting wave of violence. The story noted willful damage to railway property and telegraph lines, which had led to this threat. Dhaka police had fired on a crowd, killing 5. In August, a report from Bombay was titled "Rioting Continues in 5 Indian Areas," and noted the death toll at that point at 40. Fellow Doolittle raider Richard Cole, the following week, the Clifton Record carried a story, Indian riots molest U.S. troops there. On 20 September, the Sweetwater Reporter noted the anti-British disturbances were worse than censorship has told us. Security troubles abounded in the Wild West environment of the CPI. Dinjan had security lapses which could have enabled access, and the base had no effective perimeter fence. Local laborers refueled the craft, often leading to loading and unloading cargo, and this provided them access to critical areas of the aircraft. Unit members also hired bearers or launderers, as was standard in the British Army, and those people had no background checks performed on them. According to a message from 10th Air Force Commander, minor incidents of arson and sabotage are still occurring daily in many parts of India. Given the political instability, this was a problem. But beyond the fears of rising political violence, additional challenges in Dinjan made sabotage a plausible charge. An October story from the Roundup announced the capture of a Japanese spy. The report stated 2 U.S. airmen saw a suspicious stranger loitering about the operations office, and after an investigation and trial, he was shot as a Japanese spy. Several other reports supported the sabotage theory. In October, about a week after Gray's death, there was a Japanese air attack on Dinjan Air Base, and there were suspicions that personnel on the ground had assisted in the Japanese attack in various ways. Meanwhile, under the leadership of Indian Subhas Chandra Bose, Japan set up an army of Indian POWs known as the Indian National Army, which fought against the British. The INA also formed the Bahadur Group in September of 1942, specifically to sabotage Allied operations in India. The group tried to form a military alliance with Germany. And by the end of 1942, Britain had become aware of trained Indian espionage agents who had infiltrated into India to collect intelligence and conduct subversion activities. A bomb blast in October derailed a military train, killing many British soldiers. The movement reportedly also formed death squads to carry out acts of sabotage. And all of these events were occurring within about 150 miles of Dinjan. The weeks prior to Gray's crash, the Fort Worth Star Telegram reported about Japanese sabotage in India, and conducted by a traitorous network of spies, agitators, and saboteurs who brazenly admit taking their orders and inspiration from Tokyo. After the recovery of the crew's bodies, Robert Gray was interred in Barakpur, a British air base north of Calcutta. All across Texas, communities reacted with sympathy over the news of Gray's crash. The Only Enterprise noted, Robert Gray is missing in action. According to the story, Miss Fred Page and children left last Saturday morning for Killeen after receiving word that Robert Gray is now considered missing in action in India by the War Department. Gray, whose family lives in Killeen, was well known here and had visited many times. On 5 November, the Coleman Democrat Voice noted Gray's cousin lived in that town. The Taylor Daily News announced Gray's death and recalled he had participated in the raid in Tokyo, along with Taylor native Captain Ross Wilder. Clearly, much of Texas felt a connection to this loss. Through the haze of 80 years, it's unlikely a case one way or the other on the cause of the crash can be proved. As noted above, the personnel at Dinjan had reason to suspect sabotage, given the political and security context. The airmen clearly would have heard some of these details and, given the suspicious circumstances surrounding the crash, seized on sabotage as a likely cause. Regardless of the reason, though, his death was not in vain. The Dolittle raid itself forced the Japanese to cancel a naval raid to shut the Suez Canal in the summer of '42, helping to keep Britain in the fight. The bombing raids carried out by Gray and the Dinjan base crews undoubtedly blunted the Japanese advance at a critical moment. Had the airfields in Assam fallen to the Japanese onslaught, it's questionable whether China could have remained in the fight. The resulting shift of 1 million Japanese troops to the Pacific might have extended the war there considerably. The raiders stood in the gap under austere, ad hoc conditions. Robert Gray played a critical role in these events. He volunteered repeatedly in the face of long odds, and 6 months after the raid, he paid the price. His is a story that deserves to continue to be honored, not just in Killeen, but in Texas and the nation as a whole. Thank you.
That was amazing. Alyssa, do we have any questions so far? No questions? I have several. Um, this man was volunteering for, unbelievable missions under the worst conditions, and even with sabotage and so we're both in the dark now. But are you oh, well, we're not even done yet. You sounded like you were done.
Oh, I'm done. I just had the last slide up there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, do you've got the news articles. Have there's been any research on who he was? I mean, he was obviously heroic and willing to do, to be selfless and to volunteer for just anything. Do you know any, what was he like here in Killeen? Have you, looked into who he was as a person here? Or has he always just been set on military?
Well, his family remembers him fondly to this day, and I was in contact with several of them in terms of the research, and that's what had gotten me involved in this was they had reached out to me to say a few words at a commemoration ceremony. And, I'll just be honest, like I said at the beginning of this talk, I had heard of Robert Gray Field. I didn't know who Robert Gray was. So for me, he was a forgotten person. And when I started to dig into this, I found how unfortunate it is that he was left aside, not in Killeen per se, because as I said, Killeen for 80 years, by official proclamation of the mayor, has commemorated his legacy, and his family shows up for every one of those ceremonies and is rightly proud of him. And just in the research, though, you don't find a lot on him outside of the local area. And so I determined I'm going to write something about this guy because I think he deserves that. And so tried to find as much as I could. You know, I was lucky enough to find some of those newspaper articles where they just happened to be quoting him, you know. So I got lucky on some of that research, but I'm not aware of outside of the commemoration activities, and there's a VFW lodge named for him as well here. And they may have some stuff related to him as well. The airport, as you see, the one picture there, as you enter the lobby of the airport, has a very nice display of him. So people are doing everything they can to remember him here, and it's heartwarming that the town of Killeen does that. But I really think he should be a larger story, and so this is my small part to try to do that.
That's awesome. And you're right. You know, he played an integral part in stopping you know, lots of casualties. And the first time that I had heard, I saw the sign, you know, for the airport. Um,
I think we had a freeze up. Well, I'll try and tap dance here for just a moment. Hopefully they'll come back up and just talk about the annual Robert Gray Day celebration that they have here. And we just had it last week over at the airport. A pretty good crowd showed up. I was pretty happy to see that. A lot of people from the
I can
Robert
still
Gray.
hear you. Yeah,
Robert Gray
there you are.
VFW post. There we go. All right.
There you are. But anyway, you know, there's so many people who played integral parts in different battles, and you know, we don't even hear about them today. You know, I know you've done a lot of work on the Vietnam War, and you've done a lot of work on different wars. What's your thoughts on, you know, these people who are changing history? You know, do you feel like they're getting enough recognition?
Um, well, a short answer, no. I mean, over time, you're gonna forget a whole lot of people, and it really is a shame when you find a person whose legacy, I think, provides models for people to look back at and honor. I think you should try to hold on to those people, and I think that is really Gray's, you know, I don't want to say value, but you know, his legacy, that volunteering in the face of long odds. I mean, that's what heroism is made of, right? And a society will get more of what it honors, right? And if you honor heroism, you will get more heroism. If you don't honor that heroism, you're going to get less of it. And so I think it is a valuable thing for a society to do and should always strive to do. And so, yeah, short answer, when you have an army of 13 million people in World War II, there's no way you can remember them all. But when you find a story that's worth remembering, I think you should do what you can for that.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, you know, like you said, as a mentor, as a role model, you know, we need to learn from history. And so many times we don't learn from history. And here's a shining example of someone who gave up his life, um, you know, just to help. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he would be great. I I hope that you will continue to bring us some stories. I mean, you know, you've written so many you know, works on various sections of history, and it would be really fascinating to shine some light on, you know, different people in our history who we can learn from. So
All right. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do all the time. And, this was a story that, as I said, just fell in my lap. But I got a call, hey, could you say some words at a ceremony about Bob Gray? I had to be honest, I didn't know anything. But once they got me started on that path, and then you start unraveling these threads and you find out there's so much more to the story, that to me, that is just, it's just a fascinating thing. You're a detective trying to unearth these things. And I'm just happy I was able to do this on him. And hopefully the article I wrote for the Journal of Air and Space Power History, uh, will serve as a testament. And it's available free online to anybody. And we're going to incorporate it into our Texas history class. So anybody who takes Texas history at CTC, they will at least be um, given some knowledge of Robert Gray. And I would just urge anybody, you fly out of Killeen Airport, take a few minutes, arrive a couple minutes early, and take time to look at the very nice display and the statue they have there in the lobby.
Okay. And then, yes, if you can share, if you want to share the link for your article, we can definitely, place it in the comment section. So,
Okay.
if
Yeah.
anybody is interested in any more, information, because I know we have, we just have only a small time to learn something that would be really a very long and detailed subject.
Right. And it's about a part of the war that most people just overlook it, right? The China-Burma-India theater is usually allotted, a sentence in a history book on World War II. It really doesn't get much, but it is so critical, just as the raid itself was so critical. We focus on that morale issue, but Japan had been planning to conduct a raid against East Africa in the Suez Canal. They were sending their Navy out there, but because of the raid, they pulled that Navy fleet back, which meant that China or Britain was not forced out of the war. The raid might have done that. You'll never know, but it might have. And then talking about the fighting there in the theater, had the Japanese taken the airfields in Assam, which was entirely within their grasp without this bombing campaign, the war would have lasted longer, right? And would have cast, as you said, a lot more casualties. Again, you can't predict something that didn't happen, but it certainly would have been much more difficult to complete the war. So.
Well, and as you mentioned, it could have been sabotage,
Mm-hmm.
and with such an important campaign, it
Yeah.
may have been. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's reasonable, but you can't prove it. And the most likely scenario is it was, just some engine problem under austere conditions and not take care of the planes, and not their fault, but that's what happens. So that's the most likely cause, but it's entirely possible it was a case of sabotage. And
Well, Alyssa, any questions now? Mm, she didn't answer me, but oh, no questions now. Well, Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to go ahead and visit with us and share this information. We are thrilled. If you want to stop sharing your screen a minute so we can see you a little bit bigger.
yeah,
We're still sharing your screen.
there we
There
go.
we go.
All right.
There we go. And then you've been in the dark the whole time because
Yeah.
the light went out.
Yeah,
Good thing you
apologize for
had your
the
light. Yeah.
apologize for the tough reading. I was having a hard time seeing anything here.
It's okay. We tend to turn out people's, light on people all the
Yeah,
time.
just
So,
roll with the punches. So
hey. Well, but thank you so much. And we have you on a schedule in the fall, and you're going to be doing another historical subject on the use of GIS. during the Vietnam War, and we're very excited about that one as well. So we're looking forward to it. Thank you for joining us. Before we go, guys, I want to remind you, this Wednesday is another night sky tour with CTC astronomer Warren Hart at noon here on Facebook. So make sure that you check out that. And then this Thursday, we have our Byways finalist reception. So come on out to see all the winning paintings and drawings and listen to the poetry, short stories, to the music, all of the CTC student creative geniuses that we have here on campus. So that's in person at the library from 3 to 5 p.m. this Thursday. And then Monday, May 2nd, we're back to our environmental science series, and Fort Hood Environmental Science Department is going to do a virtual event at noon on composting. So this is where you learn to take all your banana peels and make something good out of it. And then on Thursday, May 5th, we have another author night with some more amazing authors from in the library from 6 to 8 p.m. Our author night that we had last week was very successful and fun. So come on back from 6 to 8 next Thursday and join some more fun. So, all right. Well, you guys are awesome. You guys are sliding into your exam soon. We will have coffee for finals in the library the week before finals. So make sure you check that out as well. We'll post all about it in our Facebook. So thank you again. And thank you, Dr. Roberts. And I know you need to get back to class. So I'm going to let you go.
Right.
All righty. Well, Alyssa, if you will, take us out. And Dr. Roberts, don't go away yet.